To understand how Vanessa's attempted murder would backfire so spectacularly that it would provide me with everything I needed to destroy her life through the legal system, you need to understand exactly how my carefully cultivated appearance of harmless vulnerability had created the perfect strategic camouflage for maintaining one of the most sophisticated surveillance and evidence-gathering operations that any private individual in our county had ever developed, while simultaneously encouraging exactly the kind of overconfident criminal behavior that would provide comprehensive documentation for successful prosecution and civil recovery. The image that Vanessa and virtually everyone else in our community saw when they looked at Eleanor Whitmore was precisely what I had intentionally designed to project during my transition from active investigative work to strategic retirement. The appearance of a comfortable, traditional grandmother whose modest lifestyle and quiet community involvement suggested limited resources, minimal security awareness, and the kind of trusting vulnerability that most people associate with elderly women who have gracefully stepped back from professional responsibilities in competitive environments that might have provided strategic thinking and Every detail of my public presentation had been carefully chosen to reinforce stereotypes about vulnerable elderly women while concealing the sophisticated investigative training and evidence documentation expertise that continued to operate beneath the surface of my deliberately modest suburban lifestyle. The goal wasn't deception for malicious purposes, but rather the creation of strategic advantage through selective revelation of capabilities that could be deployed more effectively when potential criminals had no reason to prepare defenses or develop countermeasures against someone they perceived as an easy target. But perhaps most importantly, the harmless appearance had been systematically designed to encourage exactly the kind of overconfident criminal behavior that would provide the most comprehensive evidence for successful prosecution. Because criminals who believe their targets are helpless and incapable of sophisticated response tend to be careless about concealing evidence and systematic about documenting their own criminal activities through communications and behavior patterns that can be used against them in court. My daily routine had been meticulously crafted to reinforce every assumption that people like Vanessa had learned to make about elderly women in suburban communities, while actually providing systematic opportunities for surveillance activities, evidence collection, and intelligence gathering that enhanced my understanding of potential threats and criminal activities throughout our neighborhood and extended community. Each morning, I awakened at 7 o'clock, the same time I had maintained throughout my professional career. But instead of preparing for complex fraud investigations and high-stakes criminal prosecutions, I began each day with what appeared to be leisurely breakfast, while actually conducting systematic intelligence gathering through carefully selected news sources, community bulletins, and professional publications that kept me current with criminal trends, legal developments, and investigative techniques that might be relevant to my personal security and on. The newspaper reading wasn't casual browsing for general interest stories, but rather systematic analysis of crime patterns, legal proceedings, and business developments that could affect potential threats to elderly residents, or provide insight into criminal activities that might require professional intervention or systematic documentation for law enforcement purposes. When the local Tribune reported on elder abuse cases or inheritance fraud prosecutions, I immediately understood the criminal methodologies and legal strategies that were being employed by people who targeted vulnerable elderly victims for financial exploitation or deliberate harm. But more importantly, the morning intelligence gathering included systematic monitoring of court records, property transfers, and business registration changes that could indicate systematic criminal activity or inheritance fraud schemes that might be developing within our community and could potentially affect my own security or require professional analysis and evidence documentation for protective purposes. After completing my intelligence analysis, I would dress in exactly the kind of comfortable, practical clothing that reinforced assumptions about my limited social aspirations and minimal concern for professional presentation or security awareness. My wardrobe consisted primarily of cardigan sweaters in muted colors, comfortable slacks from department store clearance racks, and practical walking shoes that prioritized comfort over style, or any indication of financial resources that might suggest sophisticated security arrangements or professional-grade protective measures. The clothing choices were deliberate strategic decisions rather than simply age-appropriate practicality, because they encouraged people to categorize me as a harmless elderly woman whose opinions could be safely dismissed and whose potential resistance to criminal activity could be ignored, without risk of sophisticated retaliation or professional quality evidence documentation that could support successful prosecution. Young criminals like Vanessa looked at my modest appearance and automatically assumed that someone who dressed so simply must have limited resources, minimal security awareness, and no continuing relevance to competitive environments where strategic thinking and professional expertise might provide protective advantages or systematic responses to criminal threats and manipulative behavior. What made my misdirection particularly effective was the systematic way I had integrated sophisticated surveillance and evidence-gathering technology into my apparently modest household environment, creating comprehensive documentation capabilities that could record and analyze criminal behavior while maintaining the surface appearance of a traditional elderly woman who was confused by modern technology, rather than someone who possessed professional-grade investigative equipment and systematic expertise in evidence collection and criminal analysis. The most obvious technological misdirection involved my deliberate use of an older model smartphone and apparent confusion about social media platforms and contemporary communication methods that encouraged people to assume I lacked understanding of modern surveillance capabilities or digital evidence collection that could be used to document and prosecute criminal behavior through systematic analysis of communications, behavior patterns, and criminal planning activities. "I don't really understand all these new computer things," I would tell people who observed my apparent struggles with basic smartphone functions and social media applications. "I guess I'm just too old to learn all this technology that young people use for everything these days." Quote, "The performance was convincing because it reflected genuine generational differences in technology adoption while concealing the reality that my professional training had included advanced surveillance techniques, digital evidence collection, and computer forensics that were far more sophisticated than anything most young criminals understood or could effectively counteract through basic security measures or communication encryption." But underneath my apparently confused relationship with consumer technology was a comprehensive surveillance infrastructure that included professional-grade recording equipment, advanced computer systems, and investigative software that could analyze behavior patterns, document evidence chains, and build comprehensive case files that would meet legal standards for criminal prosecution and civil litigation in federal and state court systems. The home office that occupied the converted bedroom on the second floor included multiple computer systems with specialized software for organizing evidence, analyzing communications, and building comprehensive case files that could withstand scrutiny from defense attorneys and criminal appeals processes. The equipment included professional-grade backup systems, secure data storage, and evidence protection protocols that ensured comprehensive documentation couldn't be compromised or destroyed by criminals who might discover the surveillance activities and attempt to eliminate evidence of their criminal behavior. But perhaps most importantly, the technological infrastructure included real-time communication systems that could immediately alert law enforcement agencies, legal professionals, and emergency response services if criminal activity occurred on my property, or if systematic threats escalated to the level of immediate physical danger that required professional intervention and protective response. The basement area where Vanessa would eventually attempt to murder me had been equipped with the most sophisticated surveillance technology, including multiple high-definition cameras that could document criminal activity from various angles, professional-grade audio recording equipment that could capture conversations and verbal communications with legal clarity, and motion sensors that could automatically activate recording systems and alert external security services if unauthorized persons attempted to access restricted areas or commit criminal acts on my property. My systematic participation in community activities and volunteer organizations provided exactly the kind of intelligence gathering opportunities and social camouflage that enabled me to maintain awareness of potential criminal threats while reinforcing my image as a harmless elderly woman whose activities were limited to traditional volunteer work and social engagement that posed no threat to criminal activities or systematic fraud schemes within our community. The volunteer work at Riverside Public Library appeared to represent exactly the kind of charitable activity that people expected from retired women who wanted to contribute to their communities through service, rather than continuing professional engagement with competitive environments or strategic activities that might require sophisticated thinking and professional expertise. But the library position actually provided systematic access to community information, background research capabilities, and social intelligence that enhanced my understanding of potential threats and criminal activities throughout our metropolitan area. The library's computer systems included access to legal databases, criminal records, and investigative resources that supplemented my professional subscriptions and enabled me to research background information about people who entered my social environment or family relationships. When Vanessa had first appeared in Daniel's life, I had been able to conduct comprehensive background analysis that revealed concerning patterns in her employment history, financial arrangements, and previous relationships that suggested systematic manipulation and potential criminal behavior rather than the genuine romantic interest and family integration that she had claimed to represent. But perhaps more importantly, the library work provided regular contact with community members who brought information about suspicious activities, financial scams, and potential elder abuse situations that helped me maintain current awareness of criminal trends and investigative challenges that might affect my own security or require professional intervention and systematic documentation for law enforcement purposes. The literacy program participants included people from diverse backgrounds who shared information about workplace conditions, financial pressures, and social circumstances that provided valuable context for understanding how criminal schemes developed and how vulnerable individuals were targeted for financial exploitation or systematic manipulation that could escalate to physical threats and deliberate harm. Mrs. Henderson, a 73-year-old literacy program participant, had shared concerning information about financial pressure from family members who were systematically isolating her from friends while encouraging her to modify estate planning arrangements that would provide them with immediate access to her property and financial assets. The situation had displayed exactly the same pattern of manipulation and systematic isolation that I had observed in Vanessa's treatment of Daniel and our family relationship. My daughter-in-law keeps telling me I should simplify my finances and make everything joint accounts so she can help me manage my money when I get too old to handle it myself, Mrs. Henderson had explained during one of our tutoring sessions. But something feels wrong about giving up control of my own assets when I'm still perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. The conversation had provided valuable insight into how inheritance fraud schemes typically developed, while confirming that Vanessa's systematic approach to Daniel and our family assets represented part of a broader pattern of criminal behavior that targeted elderly victims throughout our community, rather than an isolated incident of family conflict or marriage relationship difficulties. What made my misdirection particularly sophisticated was the way I had integrated comprehensive security and surveillance systems into my household environment, while maintaining the appearance of a traditional elderly woman who relied on basic home security measures rather than someone who possessed professional-grade protective equipment and systematic expertise in crime prevention and evidence documentation. The most obvious security misdirection involved the traditional alarm system and basic door locks that appeared to represent standard elderly homeowner security measures, while actually serving as the visible layer of a much more comprehensive protection system that included professional-grade surveillance equipment, hidden recording devices, and systematic documentation protocols that could provide comprehensive evidence for criminal prosecution and civil litigation. I have one of those basic alarm systems that calls the police if someone breaks in, I would explain to visitors who observed the visible security equipment. I figure that's enough protection for an old lady who doesn't have anything particularly valuable that would attract serious criminals. The explanation reinforced assumptions about limited security awareness and minimal asset protection, while concealing the reality that my household security infrastructure included multiple layers of surveillance and evidence collection that could document criminal activity with the kind of comprehensive detail that would support successful prosecution even against sophisticated criminals who understood basic security countermeasures. The hidden camera systems throughout the house included night vision capabilities, motion activation, and automatic backup recording that ensured comprehensive documentation of any criminal activity regardless of lighting conditions or attempts to disable visible security equipment. The cameras were positioned to provide multiple angles of coverage for every room and entrance, with particular attention to areas where criminal activity might occur, and evidence collection would be crucial for successful prosecution. But perhaps most importantly, the security systems included real-time monitoring and automatic alert capabilities that could immediately notify law enforcement agencies and emergency response services if criminal activity occurred, while simultaneously beginning comprehensive evidence documentation that would preserve crucial information even if criminals attempted to destroy physical evidence or eliminate witnesses to their criminal behavior. The basement surveillance system was particularly sophisticated, with multiple high-definition cameras that could document criminal activity from various perspectives. Professional-grade audio recording that could capture verbal communications and physical sounds with legal clarity, and motion sensors that automatically activated recording systems whenever anyone entered the basement area for any purpose. Perhaps the most crucial element of my strategic misdirection involved the systematic management of financial presentation to create the impression of modest retirement resources while concealing the substantial assets and professional-grade security investments that actually provided the foundation for my continuing independence and comprehensive protective capabilities against criminal threats and systematic manipulation. The appearance of limited financial resources was essential for encouraging criminals like Vanessa to underestimate my capacity for sophisticated legal response and systematic retaliation through professional quality evidence collection and comprehensive prosecution that could destroy their lives far more completely than they intended to destroy mine through criminal activity and inheritance fraud schemes. My public spending patterns were carefully designed to reinforce assumptions about fixed income limitations and reduced financial capabilities. I shopped with carefully clipped coupons at discount grocery stores, drove my 10-year-old Honda Civic until maintenance costs suggested replacement, and purchased clothing from department store clearance racks that indicated careful budget management rather than substantial financial resources or continuing investment income that could fund sophisticated security measures and professional-grade legal representation. But these modest spending patterns concealed the reality that my careful financial planning during 35 years of professional income had created substantial retirement assets that provided both security and strategic flexibility for pursuing long-term goals without concern for immediate financial constraints or budget limitations that might restrict my ability to respond to criminal threats through comprehensive legal action and systematic evidence documentation. The financial misdirection was particularly important because it prevented people like Vanessa from understanding that their criminal activities could trigger professional quality legal responses that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees, expert witnesses, and comprehensive litigation that could continue for years until complete justice had been achieved through criminal prosecution and civil recovery that would destroy their lives and eliminate any financial benefits they hoped to gain through criminal behavior. My investment portfolio included substantial holdings in legal services companies, security technology firms, and investigative consulting services that provided both financial returns and strategic insight into criminal justice developments that could affect personal security and evidence collection capabilities. The investment income alone exceeded what most people earned from full-time employment, but the modest lifestyle I maintained created the impression that I was managing limited retirement resources rather than building wealth that enhanced my strategic independence and operational capability for comprehensive response to criminal threats. What made my community involvement particularly effective for intelligence gathering and strategic positioning was the way my apparently simple volunteer activities actually provided systematic access to professional networks and information sources that enhanced my understanding of criminal activities, while maintaining comprehensive connections to legal and law enforcement professionals who could provide immediate assistance if criminal threats escalated to the level requiring professional intervention and systematic protective response. The volunteer work at community organizations appeared to represent typical elderly charitable involvement that focused on social contribution rather than strategic networking or professional relationship maintenance, that might suggest continuing relevance to competitive environments where sophisticated thinking and systematic planning could provide advantages in criminal justice situations and legal proceedings. But my community activities actually included strategic participation in organizations that provided regular contact with retired law enforcement professionals, legal service providers, and criminal justice specialists, who valued my professional background and continued to seek my advice and consultation for complex cases that required systematic evidence analysis and investigative expertise. The Riverside Community Center's advisory board included 3 retired police detectives, 2 former prosecutors, and a retired federal investigator who had worked with me on several complex fraud cases during my active career at Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. The board meetings provided regular opportunities for maintaining professional relationships and gathering intelligence about criminal trends and investigative techniques, while appearing to focus on community service and charitable activities rather than professional consultation and law enforcement networking. Detective Sarah Martinez, who had recently retired after 28 years with the County Sheriff's Department, served as the community center's security consultant, and maintained active contact with current law enforcement personnel who could provide immediate response and professional assistance if criminal activities required systematic intervention and evidence collection support. Eleanor always brings such valuable perspective to our safety discussions, Detective Martinez had mentioned during a recent board meeting that addressed elder abuse prevention and community security measures. Her background in fraud investigation helps us understand how criminals think and how we can better protect vulnerable community members from systematic exploitation and deliberate harm. The professional recognition and continuing consultation opportunities provided immediate access to law enforcement resources and criminal justice expertise, while maintaining the public appearance of simple community involvement and volunteer service that suggested limited strategic capabilities and minimal relevance to contemporary criminal justice challenges and investigative requirements. What Vanessa had completely failed to recognize was that my transition from active fraud investigation to strategic retirement hadn't eliminated my professional habits and systematic approaches to evidence collection and criminal analysis, but had actually enhanced my capabilities by providing unlimited time and resources for comprehensive investigation and documentation without the administrative constraints and bureaucratic limitations that had characterized corporate employment and organizational hierarchy. My daily routine included systematic evidence collection and behavior analysis that would have impressed any professional investigator or criminal prosecutor in our state. Every interaction with suspicious individuals was documented, every concerning behavior pattern was analyzed, and every potential criminal indicator was systematically recorded and cross-referenced with historical data and criminal trend analysis that could provide early warning of developing threats and systematic criminal planning. The documentation wasn't casual record-keeping for personal reference, but rather professional-grade evidence files that included detailed behavioral observations, systematic pattern analysis, and comprehensive supporting documentation that could meet legal standards for criminal prosecution and civil litigation in federal and state court systems. When Vanessa had first appeared in Daniel's life, I had immediately begun systematic background investigation and behavior documentation that tracked her financial activities, employment patterns, social relationships, and family interactions with the kind of detailed analysis that would provide comprehensive insight into her motivations and potential criminal planning activities. The investigation had revealed concerning patterns in her employment history, including sudden resignation from previous positions, following complaints about financial irregularities, and inappropriate access to confidential information that suggested systematic criminal behavior rather than simple job performance issues or personality conflicts with supervisors and colleagues. But perhaps more importantly, the systematic documentation had revealed that Vanessa's relationship with Daniel represented part of a broader pattern of targeting individuals with substantial inheritance prospects and family assets that could be accessed through marriage manipulation and systematic family isolation that would eliminate protective oversight and enable criminal exploitation. The evidence files included comprehensive documentation of her systematic manipulation techniques, family isolation strategies, and financial reconnaissance activities that demonstrated clear criminal intent and systematic planning for inheritance fraud and potential elder abuse that would require criminal prosecution and civil recovery to prevent successful completion of her criminal scheme. One of the most effective elements of my strategic misdirection was my apparent confusion and limited capability with modern technology and digital communication systems, which encouraged people to assume I lacked understanding of contemporary surveillance methods and evidence collection techniques that could be used to document and prosecute criminal behavior through systematic analysis of digital communications and electronic evidence. The performance was particularly convincing because it reflected genuine generational differences in consumer technology adoption while concealing extensive professional training in advanced surveillance techniques, digital forensics, and computer-based evidence collection that exceeded the technical capabilities of most young criminals who assumed their digital communications and electronic activities were secure from detection and analysis by elderly victims. I don't really understand how to use these computer things for anything complicated, I would explain when people observed my apparent struggles with basic smartphone functions and social media applications. I can barely figure out how to answer phone calls, let alone use all these fancy features that young people seem to understand naturally. Quote, but underneath the convincing performance of technological confusion was comprehensive expertise in digital surveillance, electronic evidence collection, and computer forensics that enabled me to monitor communications, analyze electronic behavior patterns, and build comprehensive digital evidence files that could support criminal prosecution and civil litigation through systematic documentation of criminal planning and systematic manipulation activities. My home computer systems included professional-grade software for monitoring electronic communications, analyzing digital behavior patterns, and organizing complex evidence files that could track criminal activities across multiple communication platforms and electronic systems. The technology included capabilities for monitoring social media activities, analyzing financial transactions, and documenting systematic patterns of criminal behavior that could provide comprehensive insight into criminal planning and systematic manipulation activities. When Vanessa had attempted to research my background and financial circumstances through internet searches and social media investigation, I had been systematically monitoring her digital activities and documenting her intelligence-gathering efforts as evidence of criminal planning and systematic preparation for financial exploitation and potential physical harm. The digital evidence collection had revealed comprehensive criminal planning that included systematic research into my daily routines, household security arrangements, and asset protection measures that suggested preparation for criminal activity rather than simple curiosity about family relationships and financial circumstances. Perhaps the most crucial aspect of my strategic misdirection was the way I had maintained physical fitness and self-defense capabilities while projecting the image of a frail elderly woman whose physical limitations would prevent effective resistance to criminal attack or systematic threats designed to intimidate and control through fear of physical harm and systematic vulnerability to criminal violence. My daily exercise routine appeared to consist of gentle gardening activities and casual neighborhood walks that reinforced assumptions about limited physical capabilities and age-related frailty, while actually maintaining the kind of strength, flexibility, and defensive awareness that would enable effective response to physical threats and systematic attacks by criminals who assumed their elderly victims were helpless and incapable of meaningful resistance. The gardening work that neighbors observed actually included systematic strength training and coordination exercises disguised as routine yard maintenance and plant care activities. The physical demands of digging, planting, and landscape maintenance provided comprehensive fitness training while appearing to represent simple retirement hobbies and aesthetic interests, rather than systematic physical preparation for potential defensive situations. But more importantly, my physical fitness routine included systematic self-defense training and emergency response preparation that would enable effective resistance to physical attack, while providing time for security systems to alert law enforcement agencies and emergency response services that could provide professional assistance and systematic protective intervention. The basement area where Vanessa would eventually attempt to murder me had been specifically prepared for defensive situations, with strategic positioning of potential defensive tools, emergency communication equipment, and protective barriers that could provide advantages during physical confrontation, while ensuring comprehensive evidence documentation of criminal activity and systematic violence. The physical preparation had been designed to ensure survival of criminal attack while providing maximum evidence collection for subsequent criminal prosecution and civil litigation that would achieve comprehensive justice and systematic retaliation against criminals who attempted to harm elderly victims through physical violence and systematic intimidation. Eleanor Whitmore had spent 5 years creating the perfect combination of apparent vulnerability and actual protective capability, encouraging exactly the kind of overconfident criminal behavior that would provide comprehensive evidence, while ensuring the criminal would face devastating consequences that would destroy their life far more completely than they had intended to destroy mine. The 70-year-old woman who appeared to be the perfect victim was actually the worst possible target for criminal activity, and Vanessa was about to discover that some elderly women are far more dangerous than they appear when you make the mistake of underestimating their professional training and systematic preparation for exactly the kind of criminal behavior that predatory individuals like her employed against vulnerable targets, who supposedly lacked the capability for sophisticated retaliation and comprehensive legal response. To understand how Vanessa's attempted murder would expose the most elaborate inheritance scheme in our family's history, you need to understand exactly how my relationship with my son Daniel had functioned for 32 years before she entered our lives, and how a woman who appeared to be the perfect daughter-in-law gradually revealed herself to be the most dangerous predator that anyone in the Whitmore family had ever encountered. Daniel hadn't always been vulnerable to the kind of systematic manipulation and family isolation that Vanessa would eventually employ to gain control over his financial decisions and personal relationships. For most of his adult life, my son had been genuinely independent, professionally competent, and obviously devoted to maintaining strong family connections while building his own career and personal identity, without depending on family financial support or emotional manipulation to achieve his goals and personal satisfaction. The relationship between Daniel and me had been built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the kind of collaborative problem-solving that created both personal fulfillment and practical benefits for our individual development and family stability. Unlike many parent-adult-child relationships that were characterized by dependency, obligation, or systematic conflict, our interactions had been voluntarily chosen and mutually beneficial exchanges that enhanced rather than limited our individual autonomy and personal growth. But perhaps most importantly, our family relationship had been characterized by open communication about financial planning, inheritance considerations, and long-term security arrangements that provided Daniel with comprehensive understanding of family assets, estate planning decisions, and the substantial inheritance that would eventually transfer to him through carefully structured legal arrangements that protected family wealth, while ensuring his long-term financial security and independence. Daniel had always known exactly what he stood to inherit from my estate, including the family home on Maple Avenue, investment portfolios that I had built through decades of careful financial planning, and liquid assets that would provide him with substantial financial independence and security for the remainder of his life. But more importantly, he had understood that his inheritance was guaranteed regardless of his personal relationships or marriage choices, because family wealth transfer had been structured through professional estate planning that couldn't be influenced by spouses or manipulated through emotional pressure or systematic family isolation. The inheritance arrangements had been designed specifically to prevent exactly the kind of manipulation and financial exploitation that predators like Vanessa typically employed against elderly family members and their adult children. Legal documents, trust structures, and asset protection protocols had been established through comprehensive professional planning that would ensure family wealth remained within family control regardless of marriage relationships, divorce proceedings, or attempts at systematic financial manipulation by people who sought to gain access to family assets through marriage or emotional coercion. My son Daniel had built a successful and independent life that provided both personal satisfaction and professional advancement without relying on family financial support or emotional dependency that might have made him vulnerable to the kind of systematic manipulation that predatory individuals often employed against people with substantial inheritance prospects or family wealth that could be accessed through strategic relationship development and emotional control. At 35 years old, Daniel worked as a certified public accountant at Harrison Mitchell & Associates, a well-established accounting firm in downtown Riverside, where he managed tax preparation, financial consulting, and estate planning services for middle-class families and small business owners who valued his professional competence and reliable service approach. His career had been built through individual effort and professional development rather than family connections or inherited advantages, creating genuine confidence and personal satisfaction that provided psychological independence and emotional stability. Daniel's professional success had enabled him to purchase his own home, a comfortable ranch-style house in the Brookside neighborhood that reflected his personal taste and financial capability, rather than dependence on family resources or assistance with major purchases that might have created obligation or emotional leverage for potential manipulators seeking to influence his personal relationships or financial decisions. But perhaps most importantly, Daniel had maintained an active social life that included longtime friendships, professional relationships, and community involvement that provided diverse sources of personal fulfillment and emotional support beyond family relationships. His social network included college friends who had known him for over 15 years, professional colleagues who respected his work quality and personal character, and neighbors who appreciated his helpful attitude and community participation. The social connections had created multiple independent sources of feedback and perspective that helped Daniel evaluate personal relationships and make decisions based on genuine compatibility, rather than emotional manipulation or systematic isolation that predatory individuals often employed to gain control over their target's social environment and decision-making processes. Daniel's dating history had been characterized by healthy relationships with women who possessed their own professional careers, financial independence, and personal goals that complemented rather than competed with his family relationships and individual aspirations. Previous girlfriends had been genuinely interested in getting to know our family, participating in holiday celebrations, and building relationships based on mutual respect rather than strategic positioning for financial advantage or inheritance access. When Daniel first introduced Vanessa during a casual dinner at my house in March 2021, I had been genuinely pleased that he had found someone who seemed to make him happy and who expressed apparent interest in developing family relationships and participating in our established traditions and social activities. Initial observations had suggested that Vanessa possessed the kind of professional competence and personal maturity that would complement Daniel's personality while enhancing rather than limiting his individual growth and family connections. Vanessa had presented herself as a 29-year-old marketing coordinator at Riverside Regional Hospital, with professional credentials and career advancement that suggested individual capability and financial independence rather than the kind of dependency or financial vulnerability that might motivate systematic inheritance planning or manipulative relationship development designed to gain access to family assets through marriage or emotional coercion. Her initial behavior during family gatherings had been appropriately respectful and genuinely engaging, with obvious efforts to learn about family history, participate in established traditions, and demonstrate appreciation for the relationship foundations that Daniel and I had built over decades of mutual respect and collaborative problem-solving. She had asked thoughtful questions about family background, shown interest in my professional history, and expressed appreciation for the family dynamics that had contributed to Daniel's personal development and professional success. But looking back with the investigative expertise that 35 years of fraud detection had provided, I now recognize that Vanessa's initial behavior had included several subtle indicators that should have triggered professional caution and systematic observation, rather than the trusting acceptance that I had offered based on Daniel's happiness and apparent relationship satisfaction. The first red flag had been Vanessa's systematic questions about family financial arrangements, inheritance planning, and asset distribution that went far beyond casual curiosity or normal interest in understanding family background and financial security. During our second meeting, she had asked specific questions about property ownership, investment portfolios, and estate planning arrangements that seemed unusually detailed for someone who had been dating Daniel for only a few months and had no legitimate reason to understand family financial structures or inheritance arrangements. Daniel mentioned that you own your house outright and have been really successful with investments, Vanessa had said during a conversation that I had initially interpreted as normal interest in family financial stability rather than systematic intelligence gathering about asset values and inheritance prospects. I think it's so impressive when people can build real wealth and security for their families. Have you done estate planning to make sure everything transfers smoothly when the time comes? The question had been phrased as admiration and casual interest, but it had included terminology and concepts that suggested more sophisticated understanding of estate planning and wealth transfer than most people possessed without professional involvement in financial services or systematic research into inheritance procedures and asset protection strategies. The second red flag had been Vanessa's immediate and systematic efforts to position herself as Daniel's primary emotional support and decision-making advisor, despite having known him for less time than many of his established friendships and professional relationships. Within 6 months of their first meeting, she had begun making subtle suggestions about limiting time with family and longtime friends, while encouraging greater dependence on her opinions and emotional support for personal and professional decisions. You spend so much time worrying about what your mother thinks about everything, Vanessa had told Daniel during a conversation that I had overheard during one of their visits to my house. I think you'd be happier if you focused more on building our relationship and planning our future together instead of always checking with family about every decision you make. The comment had been presented as concern for Daniel's independence and relationship development, but it had actually represented the beginning of systematic isolation and emotional manipulation, designed to reduce his access to alternative perspectives and independent advice that might interfere with her ability to influence his thinking and control his decision-making processes. The third red flag had been Vanessa's obvious discomfort and strategic avoidance during conversations about my professional background and investigative expertise, particularly when Daniel mentioned my experience with fraud detection and criminal investigation, that had characterized my career at Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. Instead of showing normal curiosity or professional interest, she had consistently changed conversation topics or found reasons to leave the room when discussions involved my investigative work or legal expertise. "That sounds really interesting, but I'm not much of a crime and investigation person," Vanessa had explained when Daniel began describing some of my more notable fraud cases and criminal prosecutions. "I prefer to focus on positive things rather than thinking about all the terrible people who try to cheat and manipulate others for money." Quote. The response had seemed like normal personal preference and conversation style at the time, but in retrospect, it had represented deliberate avoidance of information that might have provided insight into my professional capabilities and the investigative techniques that could be applied to detecting and documenting systematic manipulation or criminal behavior within family relationships. During the 18 months following their initial meeting, Vanessa had implemented a comprehensive isolation campaign designed to systematically reduce Daniel's emotional and social connections while increasing his dependence on her opinions and support for personal and professional decision-making that would ultimately affect his financial planning and family relationship priorities. The isolation process had begun with subtle suggestions about time management and relationship priorities that gradually evolved into systematic criticism of family and friend relationships that supposedly interfered with their romantic development and future planning. Vanessa had consistently presented her isolation demands as evidence of love and commitment, rather than controlling behavior designed to eliminate alternative sources of advice and emotional support that might interfere with her manipulative influence. "I just feel like we never have enough time together because you're always visiting your mother or hanging out with those college friends," Vanessa had complained during conversations that Daniel had shared with me during our regular phone calls and family visits. "I want to build something special with you, but it's hard when you're always focused on other people instead of our relationship." The complaints had been strategically designed to make Daniel feel guilty about maintaining independent relationships, while positioning Vanessa as the victim of his supposedly divided attention and insufficient romantic commitment. The emotional manipulation had been subtle but systematic, gradually creating pressure for Daniel to reduce time with family and friends in order to prove his love and dedication to their relationship development. But perhaps more concerning had been Vanessa's systematic efforts to undermine Daniel's confidence in family financial advice and professional guidance that I had provided throughout his adult life for major financial decisions, career planning, and investment strategies that had contributed to his professional success and personal financial security. "Your mother means well, but she's from a different generation and doesn't really understand how modern financial planning works," Vanessa had told Daniel when he sought my advice about investment opportunities and retirement planning strategies. "I think we should consult with younger financial advisors who understand contemporary market conditions rather than relying on outdated advice that might not be appropriate for our situation." The suggestion had been presented as professional concern and modern thinking, but it had actually represented systematic efforts to eliminate my influence over Daniel's financial decision-making while positioning herself as his primary advisor for major financial choices that would ultimately affect his inheritance planning and asset protection strategies. When Daniel and Vanessa announced their engagement in October 2022, I had been genuinely happy for his apparent relationship satisfaction, while simultaneously concerned about the systematic changes in his behavior and family relationship patterns that had become increasingly obvious during their 18-month dating period. The engagement had represented both celebration of his personal happiness and recognition that Vanessa would soon possess legal standing and potential influence over family financial arrangements that could affect inheritance planning and estate administration in ways that required careful monitoring and protective measures. My professional experience with inheritance fraud and family financial manipulation had taught me that marriage often represented the beginning rather than the end of systematic efforts to gain control over family assets, particularly when one spouse possessed substantial inheritance prospects that could be accessed through legal proceedings, emotional manipulation, or systematic isolation that prevented effective family oversight and protective intervention. The wedding planning process had provided additional opportunities for observing Vanessa's priorities and motivations, particularly her obvious focus on expensive celebration elements and luxury arrangements that seemed inconsistent with her stated professional income and financial circumstances. Her insistence on elaborate venue selection, designer elements, and costly celebration features had suggested either hidden financial resources or systematic planning to establish lifestyle expectations that would require substantial ongoing financial support from Daniel's income and potential inheritance assets. "We want this to be really special and memorable," Vanessa had explained when Daniel expressed concern about wedding costs that exceeded their combined annual income and would require substantial financial assistance from family resources or long-term debt obligations. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime celebration, and I think we should invest in making it perfect, rather than settling for something ordinary that we might regret later." The financial pressure had been strategically designed to establish precedent for expensive lifestyle choices while testing Daniel's willingness to prioritize her preferences over financial prudence and family advice about sustainable spending patterns and long-term financial planning that would preserve rather than consume his inheritance prospects and financial security. But perhaps most concerning had been Vanessa's systematic efforts to influence Daniel's estate planning and legal arrangements following their marriage, including suggestions about updating beneficiary designations, modifying insurance policies, and establishing joint financial accounts that would provide her with immediate access to his assets and inheritance prospects in the event of his death or incapacitation. "I think we should make sure all our financial arrangements reflect our married status," Vanessa had suggested within 3 months of their wedding ceremony. "We should update all the insurance policies and bank accounts to make sure everything transfers automatically if something happens to either of us. And maybe we should talk to your mother about updating her estate planning to include me as a family member." The suggestions had been presented as normal marriage financial planning and family integration, but they had actually represented systematic efforts to gain legal access to family assets, while establishing herself as a legitimate beneficiary for inheritance purposes that could supersede existing estate planning arrangements and family asset protection protocols. During the first year of their marriage, Vanessa's behavior toward me had gradually evolved from polite tolerance to obvious hostility, as she apparently concluded that my continued influence over Daniel's thinking and family loyalty represented an obstacle to her systematic control over his financial decisions and inheritance planning priorities. The hostility had manifested through increasingly obvious disrespect during family gatherings, systematic criticism of my opinions and advice when Daniel shared our conversations with her, and deliberate efforts to sabotage family traditions and social arrangements that had previously provided positive interaction and mutual enjoyment for our family relationships. "I don't understand why Daniel still calls his mother for advice about everything," Vanessa had complained during conversations that Daniel had shared with me when seeking my perspective on the growing tension in his marriage relationship. "He's a grown man with a wife, and I think he should be making decisions with me instead of always running to his mother like he's still a teenager." The complaints had been designed to position my family relationship as immature dependency rather than healthy collaboration, while presenting herself as the appropriate source of adult guidance and emotional support that should replace rather than complement our established family connection and mutual assistance patterns. But more concerning had been Vanessa's systematic efforts to create conflict during family gatherings through deliberate provocative comments, obvious disrespect for family traditions, and strategic behavior designed to make our interactions uncomfortable and unpleasant, rather than the positive experiences that had characterized our family relationships for decades. During Christmas dinner 2023, Vanessa had made several pointed comments about, quote, outdated family dynamics and unhealthy dependency relationships that had been clearly directed at undermining my relationship with Daniel, while positioning herself as the mature adult who understood appropriate family boundaries and modern relationship standards. "I think some families have trouble accepting when adult children grow up and develop their own priorities," Vanessa had announced during dinner conversation that had previously been focused on holiday traditions and positive family memories. "It's important for married couples to establish their own independence rather than being controlled by family expectations that don't respect their adult autonomy." The comments had been strategically designed to create awkwardness and tension while establishing her narrative that our family relationship represented inappropriate control rather than healthy mutual support and collaborative problem-solving that had benefited both Daniel and me throughout his adult development. What I hadn't initially recognized but became clear through systematic observation and documentation over several months was that Vanessa's hostility toward me was directly related to her growing understanding that my estate planning and asset protection arrangements would prevent her from accessing family wealth through Daniel's inheritance, regardless of their marriage relationship, or any attempts at systematic manipulation and family isolation. Professional estate planning consultations that I had arranged through my attorney had included specific protections against spousal claims and inheritance manipulation that would ensure family assets remained under family control even if Daniel's marriage relationship was compromised by financial predators or systematic manipulation designed to gain access to inheritance prospects through emotional coercion or legal proceedings. The asset protection protocols included trust structures, beneficiary arrangements, and legal safeguards that would prevent anyone other than Daniel from gaining access to family wealth, while also protecting those assets from potential claims by spouses, creditors, or other parties who might seek to influence or control inheritance distribution through legal challenges or systematic manipulation of family relationships. But more importantly, the estate planning had been structured to require Daniel's continuing family relationship and collaborative decision-making for accessing certain inheritance benefits, creating systematic incentives for maintaining family connections rather than allowing complete isolation or manipulation that might compromise his judgment about financial planning and asset protection that would preserve rather than consume family wealth over multiple generations. Vanessa's systematic questioning about estate planning details and inheritance arrangements had eventually revealed her growing awareness that marriage to Daniel wouldn't automatically provide access to family assets, and that her systematic isolation efforts had been strategically designed to eliminate my influence over financial decisions that could affect her ability to gain control over inheritance prospects through emotional manipulation or legal proceedings. I've been thinking we should understand more about your mother's estate planning and what Daniel can expect to inherit, Vanessa had told Daniel during conversations that he had shared with me when seeking advice about appropriate responses to her systematic financial questioning. I think we should know what assets are involved and how they're structured so we can do our own financial planning and make sure we're prepared for any legal or tax implications. The request had been presented as responsible financial planning and marriage communication, but it had actually represented systematic intelligence gathering about asset values, legal structures, and inheritance arrangements that could inform strategic planning for gaining access to family wealth through manipulation, legal challenges, or systematic efforts to compromise Daniel's judgment and family loyalty. By the spring of 2024, approximately 18 months after their marriage, Vanessa had apparently concluded that systematic isolation and emotional manipulation wouldn't be sufficient for gaining control over Daniel's inheritance prospects, and her behavior had escalated to include subtle but unmistakable threats about my continued influence over family financial decisions and inheritance arrangements. The threats had been carefully phrased to avoid obvious criminal intent, while clearly communicating her growing frustration with estate planning arrangements that protected family assets from spousal access, and her systematic recognition that eliminating my influence might be necessary for achieving her financial objectives and inheritance access goals. It must be difficult for elderly people to know when it's time to step back and let the younger generation take control of family financial decisions, Vanessa had said during a family dinner conversation that had supposedly been focused on general estate planning and retirement considerations. Sometimes older people hold on too long and create problems that could be avoided if they were more realistic about their declining capabilities and judgment. The comment had been directed specifically at me while being phrased as general observation about aging and family financial transitions, but the hostile tone and obvious intent had clearly communicated threats about my continued involvement in family financial planning and Daniel's inheritance protection arrangements. But perhaps most concerning had been Vanessa's systematic efforts to research my daily routines, household security arrangements, and social patterns that could provide information useful for planning systematic harassment, property damage, or physical threats designed to intimidate me into modifying estate planning arrangements, or reducing my influence over Daniel's financial decisions and family loyalty. Eleanor seems to live pretty independently for someone her age, Vanessa had mentioned during conversations with Daniel about family arrangements and my household management capabilities. I wonder if she ever feels unsafe living alone in that big house, especially with all the valuable things she must have accumulated over the years. The observations had been presented as casual concern about my security and safety, but they had actually represented systematic intelligence gathering about potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited for intimidation, property crime, or physical threats designed to influence my behavior in family financial arrangements through fear and systematic pressure rather than legal challenges or emotional manipulation. During the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving 2024, when Vanessa would eventually attempt to murder me, her behavior had escalated to include increasingly obvious threats and hostile behavior that suggested systematic planning for direct action, rather than continued efforts at emotional manipulation or legal pressure, designed to influence family financial arrangements and inheritance planning. The escalation had been characterized by systematic questions about my daily schedule, security arrangements, and social patterns that could provide information useful for planning criminal activity, combined with increasingly obvious hostility during family interactions, and systematic efforts to isolate Daniel from sources of advice and emotional support that might interfere with her control over his thinking and decision-making processes. "Your mother seems to spend a lot of time alone in that house," Vanessa had observed during conversations with Daniel about family arrangements and holiday planning. "I hope she's being careful about safety and security, especially since she probably has a lot of valuable things that might attract the wrong kind of attention from people who target elderly women." The comments had been strategically designed to appear as concern while actually representing threats about my vulnerability to criminal activity and systematic pressure designed to influence my behavior through fear and intimidation, rather than direct confrontation or legal challenges that might expose her criminal intentions and systematic planning for financial exploitation. But the most obvious warning sign had been Vanessa's systematic efforts to arrange family gatherings and social situations where she would have access to my house and private property while other family members were distracted or absent, creating opportunities for criminal activity, evidence gathering, or systematic intimidation that could advance her financial objectives without obvious criminal intent or behavior that could be easily documented and reported to law enforcement agencies. The Thanksgiving dinner invitation had been presented as normal family holiday celebration and relationship building, but it had actually represented the culmination of months of systematic planning for criminal activity, designed to eliminate the primary obstacle to her inheritance access and financial exploitation of Daniel's family assets and long-term financial security. Eleanor Whitmore had spent 35 years learning to recognize criminal planning and systematic manipulation, and every aspect of Vanessa's behavior during the months leading up to Thanksgiving had indicated comprehensive preparation for criminal activity that would require immediate documentation and legal response, rather than continued observation or attempts at family relationship repair and collaborative problem-solving. The woman who appeared to be planning a family celebration was actually arranging the perfect opportunity for attempted murder, and the supposedly helpless elderly victim was about to demonstrate exactly what happens when professional investigators are systematically underestimated by criminals who believe their planning is more sophisticated than the expertise they're attempting to overcome. When my manipulative daughter-in-law Vanessa pushed me down the basement stairs at Thanksgiving dinner while everyone was distracted in the kitchen and whispered, "Accidents happen to old ladies who don't know when to mind their own business," she had no idea that this supposedly frail 70-year-old retired insurance investigator was going to let her think she'd successfully eliminated the only person standing between her and my son's inheritance, then used 35 years of fraud detection expertise and documented evidence to destroy her life so completely in court that she'd end up losing everything she thought she was going to steal. Before I tell you how a woman who spent 3 decades investigating insurance fraud and building bulletproof legal cases used hidden surveillance equipment and investigative techniques to turn an attempted murder into the most devastating lawsuit in our county's history, tell me in the comments if you've ever had someone underestimate your capabilities so badly that they basically handed you everything you needed to destroy them. And if this story of calculated justice resonates with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have another incredible story about why you should never assume that a quiet elderly woman doesn't know exactly how to document evidence. My name is Eleanor Ellie Whitmore. I'm 70 years old, and I'm about to tell you how my scheming, gold-digging daughter-in-law Vanessa, who had spent the last 3 years systematically isolating my son Daniel from his family while positioning herself to inherit everything when I died, made the catastrophic mistake of trying to murder someone who had spent her entire career learning how to detect, document, and prosecute people who thought they could get away with elaborate schemes for financial gain. To understand how Vanessa's attempted murder would ultimately trigger the most comprehensive legal destruction in Whitmore family history, you need to understand exactly how my relationship with my son's wife had deteriorated from polite tolerance to systematic hostility, as she gradually revealed her true intentions and began treating me like an obstacle that needed to be eliminated, rather than a family member who deserved basic respect and consideration. But more importantly, you need to understand what Vanessa had never bothered to research about the supposedly helpless old woman she decided to push down a flight of concrete stairs. That Eleanor Whitmore wasn't just some retired grandmother living on a pension. but a former senior insurance fraud investigator who had spent 35 years at Metropolitan Life Insurance Company building cases against people who thought they could stage accidents, fake injuries, and commit elaborate frauds without leaving evidence trails that would eventually destroy their lives in court. The truth about my professional background was something I had deliberately kept understated during my retirement years, not because I was ashamed of my accomplishments, but because I had learned through decades of investigative work that people reveal their true intentions more readily when they believe they're dealing with someone who lacks the expertise to recognize manipulation and document criminal behavior. My modest presentation and quiet retirement lifestyle had been strategically designed to encourage exactly the kind of overconfidence and careless behavior that Vanessa would eventually display when she decided that eliminating me was the fastest path to accessing my son's inheritance and the substantial assets I had accumulated through decades of careful investment and strategic financial planning. What Vanessa saw when she looked at me was precisely what I had intentionally cultivated: the image of a typical elderly widow whose limited understanding of legal procedures and evidence documentation would make her an easy target for manipulation and, ultimately, elimination without serious consequences for the perpetrator. Every aspect of my public presentation had been carefully chosen to reinforce stereotypes about vulnerable elderly women while concealing the sophisticated investigative training and evidence-gathering expertise that continued to operate beneath the surface of my deliberately modest suburban lifestyle. The woman Vanessa dismissed as a harmless obstacle to her inheritance plans appeared to live exactly the kind of simple, predictable retirement that most people associated with elderly widows who had gracefully stepped back from professional responsibilities and competitive environments. My daily routine reinforced every assumption that people like Vanessa had learned to make about 70-year-old women in suburban communities. Awakening at 7 each morning to read the local newspaper over coffee, tending to a modest garden behind my 2-story colonial house, and spending afternoons volunteering at Riverside Public Library, where I helped elderly patrons navigate computer systems and assisted with community literacy programs. My transportation choices followed the same strategic principles of deliberate understatement, designed to reinforce assumptions about limited resources and minimal social connections. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with conservative bumper stickers about supporting local libraries and community programs, modest exterior wear that suggested careful budget management, and an interior that showed the comfortable use patterns of someone whose driving priorities focused on reliability and economy rather than status or professional presentation. The vehicle choice was particularly effective misdirection because it encouraged assumptions about fixed income limitations while concealing the reality that I could easily afford any car I wanted, but had chosen modest transportation as part of comprehensive strategic camouflage designed to prevent potential adversaries from accurately assessing my resources or capabilities. When Vanessa or other family members saw me driving my aging Honda to grocery stores with carefully clipped coupons and discount shopping lists, they automatically reinforced their assumptions about my reduced circumstances and limited strategic thinking, without recognizing that the woman behind the wheel was someone who had spent 35 years developing systematic approaches to evidence collection, behavior analysis, and criminal investigation that could be applied to any situation where someone was attempting fraud, manipulation, or deliberate harm against potential victims. My housing situation provided additional layers of strategic misdirection that reinforced every stereotype about elderly women living on modest retirement incomes, while concealing the sophisticated investigative infrastructure and substantial financial resources that continued to operate behind the scenes of my carefully managed suburban retirement lifestyle. The modest 2-story colonial house on Maple Avenue, where I had lived for 23 years, appeared to represent exactly the kind of traditional family home that suggested conventional values, limited resources, and the gradual scaling back of social ambitions that most people expected from women in their 70s. The house itself was comfortable and well-maintained, but deliberately modest in ways that discouraged assumptions about significant wealth or continuing professional activities. The landscaping was neat but simple, the exterior was recently painted but in conservative colors, and the overall presentation suggested someone who maintained appropriate pride in her property without aspirations for impressive display or social status that might indicate ongoing business involvement, or extensive financial resources that could fund legal challenges or investigative activities. But what visitors to my Maple Avenue house couldn't see was the sophisticated investigative workspace that occupied the converted bedroom on the second floor, where I maintained comprehensive filing systems, professional communication equipment, and evidence documentation resources that would have impressed any detective or legal investigator in our metropolitan area. The office included secure storage for sensitive documents, professional-grade recording equipment, and computer systems with specialized software for organizing evidence and building comprehensive case files that could withstand scrutiny from defense attorneys and insurance company investigators. The basement that would eventually become the scene of Vanessa's attempted murder housed additional investigative resources including surveillance equipment, backup documentation systems, and secure storage for physical evidence that I had been systematically collecting during my retirement years. But more importantly, the basement included professional-grade security cameras that I had installed throughout the house, ostensibly for general safety purposes, but actually for comprehensive documentation of any suspicious behavior or criminal activity that might occur on my property. The security system wasn't the kind of basic home protection that most elderly homeowners installed for peace of mind. It was a sophisticated surveillance network that could document audio and video evidence with the kind of clarity and comprehensive coverage that would meet legal standards for criminal prosecution and civil litigation. Every room in the house was monitored, every conversation was recorded, and every instance of suspicious behavior was automatically archived with timestamp documentation that could establish precise sequences of events and behavioral patterns over extended periods of time. But Vanessa had never seen that office or understood the scope of investigative activity that continued to operate beneath the surface of my apparently peaceful retirement, because her dismissive assumptions about my limitations had prevented her from developing genuine curiosity about my actual activities or continuing professional engagement with legal and investigative networks that could affect her own criminal activities in ways she had never considered or researched. What made Vanessa's strategic miscalculation particularly catastrophic was her complete failure to research or understand the specific nature of my professional background and the investigative expertise that I had developed through 35 years of systematic experience with people who believed they could commit fraud, stage accidents, and manipulate legal systems without leaving evidence trails that would eventually lead to their prosecution and financial destruction. My career at Metropolitan Life Insurance Company hadn't been ordinary administrative work or customer service. It had been specialized training in detecting and prosecuting the most sophisticated insurance fraudsters, medical scammers, and elaborate criminal schemes that cost insurance companies millions of dollars annually and required comprehensive investigation, evidence collection, and legal coordination to successfully pursue through civil and criminal court systems. As a senior insurance fraud investigator, I had been responsible for building cases against people who staged automobile accidents, faked disability claims, arranged deliberate property damage, and even orchestrated elaborate schemes involving false medical documentation and fraudulent injury claims that required months or years of systematic investigation to uncover and prove in court. My success rate in securing convictions and recovering fraudulent payouts had been among the highest in the company's history, and my investigative techniques and evidence documentation procedures had been used as training examples for investigators throughout the insurance industry. But perhaps most relevant to Vanessa's eventual prosecution was my specialized expertise in cases involving elderly victims and inheritance fraud, where criminals specifically targeted vulnerable older adults for financial exploitation, deliberate harm, or systematic manipulation designed to gain access to assets and property through illegal means. I had investigated dozens of cases where family members, caregivers, or supposed beneficiaries had attempted to accelerate inheritance timelines through deliberate harm, staged accidents, or systematic abuse that was designed to appear accidental or natural, while actually constituting criminal assault and attempted murder. The investigative protocols I had developed for elderly victim cases included sophisticated surveillance techniques, comprehensive behavior documentation, and systematic evidence collection that could establish criminal intent and prove deliberate harm, even when perpetrators believed they had successfully concealed their activities or created plausible explanations for apparently accidental incidents. My expertise in these cases had been recognized by law enforcement agencies throughout our state, and I had been called as an expert witness in numerous criminal trials involving elder abuse, inheritance fraud, and attempted murder disguised as accidents. During my final 5 years at Metropolitan Life, I had been promoted to Director of Special Investigations, with responsibility for training other investigators and developing new techniques for detecting sophisticated fraud schemes that evolved faster than traditional investigative approaches could address. The position had required me to stay current with legal procedures, evidence standards, and criminal prosecution techniques that would ensure our investigations produced results that could withstand challenges from defense attorneys and criminal appeals processes. But more importantly, my senior position had provided me with extensive contacts throughout the legal system, including prosecutors, criminal investigators, forensic specialists, and expert witnesses who could provide professional testimony and technical analysis that would support comprehensive criminal cases against people who thought they could commit crimes without leaving sufficient evidence for successful prosecution. When I retired from Metropolitan Life 5 years ago, I had maintained consulting relationships with several law enforcement agencies and continued to provide expert testimony in complex fraud cases that required specialized knowledge of investigative techniques and evidence analysis. My professional reputation and legal credentials had remained active and current, providing immediate access to resources and professional networks that could support criminal investigations and civil litigation far beyond what most private individuals could access or afford. My transition from active investigation work to strategic retirement had been carefully planned to maintain professional capabilities while creating the kind of modest lifestyle that would encourage potential criminals to underestimate my resources and expertise. The goal wasn't deception for its own sake, but rather the creation of strategic advantage through selective revelation of capabilities that could be deployed more effectively when potential adversaries had no reason to prepare defenses or develop countermeasures against someone they perceived as harmless and incapable of sophisticated response. Every aspect of my retirement routine had been designed to reinforce assumptions about limited capabilities while actually providing systematic opportunities for maintaining investigative skills and gathering intelligence that enhanced my understanding of local criminal activities and potential threats to elderly residents throughout our community. My volunteer work at Riverside Public Library provided regular contact with community members who brought information about suspicious activities, financial scams, and potential elder abuse situations that helped me stay current with criminal trends and investigative challenges that might affect my own security or require professional intervention. The library work also provided access to legal databases, criminal records, and investigative resources that supplemented my professional subscriptions and maintained my ability to research backgrounds, track criminal histories, and access information that would support comprehensive case development if circumstances required systematic documentation and evidence collection for legal purposes. But most people who saw me helping elderly patrons with computer problems assumed I was simply a kind volunteer, rather than someone who was maintaining professional-level access to investigative tools and legal resources. My community involvement included strategic participation in neighborhood watch programs, senior safety initiatives, and elder abuse prevention activities that provided valuable intelligence about criminal activities while positioning me as a concerned community member rather than someone with professional investigative expertise and active connections to law enforcement agencies. The activities appeared to represent typical elderly volunteer work while actually providing systematic opportunities for maintaining professional relationships and gathering business intelligence that enhanced my understanding of local crime patterns and potential threats. But perhaps the most strategically valuable aspect of my carefully managed community involvement was the systematic documentation and evidence collection that I maintained regarding suspicious activities, criminal behavior, and potential threats to elderly residents throughout our neighborhood and extended community. The documentation wasn't casual record-keeping for personal reference, but rather professional-grade evidence files that could support criminal investigations and civil litigation if circumstances required comprehensive legal action against people who targeted elderly victims for financial exploitation or deliberate harm. What made Vanessa's attempt to murder me particularly catastrophic was her fundamental misunderstanding of how modern investigative techniques and evidence documentation could be applied to apparently simple criminal acts, like pushing someone downstairs while believing that the absence of direct witnesses would prevent successful prosecution or civil recovery. Vanessa had apparently concluded that staging my death as an accidental fall would be the perfect crime because elderly people frequently suffered fatal injuries from household accidents, and because she assumed that the absence of other family members as direct witnesses would make it impossible to prove deliberate intent or criminal behavior that would justify legal consequences beyond a simple accidental death investigation. But Vanessa's criminal planning had been based on outdated assumptions about evidence requirements and investigative capabilities that ignored how comprehensive surveillance systems, forensic analysis, and systematic behavior documentation could establish criminal intent and prove deliberate harm, even without direct human witnesses to the specific criminal act. More importantly, Vanessa had never considered that her intended victim might possess exactly the kind of professional expertise and legal resources necessary for building comprehensive criminal cases against people who believed they could commit murder without leaving sufficient evidence for successful prosecution and civil recovery. The woman she had decided to eliminate was about to demonstrate that 35 years of investigating people exactly like her had provided comprehensive knowledge of how criminals think, how they attempt to conceal evidence, and what investigative techniques could uncover proof of deliberate criminal behavior even when perpetrators believed they had successfully covered their tracks. Eleanor Whitmore had spent her entire career learning how to catch people who thought they were smarter than the system, and Vanessa was about to become the most devastating case study in why you should never try to commit crimes against someone whose life work was detecting and prosecuting people exactly like you. The 70-year-old woman who appeared to be the perfect victim was actually the worst possible target for someone planning to commit murder and inherit assets through criminal activity. But Vanessa would only discover this after she had already committed attempted murder and provided comprehensive evidence that would destroy her life far more completely than she had ever planned to destroy mine. Have you ever had someone so completely underestimate your professional capabilities that they basically handed you everything you needed to destroy them? Drop a comment below and let me know, because this story is just getting started, and Vanessa is about to learn that some grandmothers are far more dangerous than they appear. If you want to see how this plays out and hear more stories about people who discovered the hard way that appearances can be deceiving, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Tomorrow's story is about a young nurse who thought she could steal from a confused elderly patient. Spoiler alert, she learned exactly why that was the worst decision of her professional career. The foundation has been established, and Vanessa's complete misunderstanding of who she was targeting would soon trigger the most comprehensive legal destruction that anyone in our family history had ever witnessed. The quiet retirement lifestyle that had lulled her into overconfidence was about to become the perfect cover for systematic evidence collection and criminal prosecution that would demonstrate exactly what happens when you try to murder someone whose professional expertise was specifically designed to catch people exactly like you. To understand how Vanessa's attempted murder would trigger the most comprehensive legal destruction in our county's history, you need to understand exactly how a determined 25-year-old woman named Eleanor Patterson had transformed from a recent college graduate with a degree in criminal justice into the most feared insurance fraud investigator in Metropolitan Life's corporate history, building the kind of systematic expertise and professional network that would continue to provide devastating capabilities 35 years after she first learned that some people will do absolutely anything for money, including. The story of how Eleanor Whitmore built an empire of professional influence that could destroy criminal lives with surgical precision had begun in September 1987, when a young woman with limited professional experience but unlimited determination to catch criminals had responded to a classified advertisement for an entry-level claims investigator with growth potential at Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, a position that would eventually provide comprehensive training in every aspect of criminal detection, evidence collection, and legal prosecution that anyone in the insurance industry had ever developed or maintained. The job interview had been conducted in a cramped office that smelled of coffee and case files, where Regional Investigation Director William Morrison, a former FBI agent with 23 years of federal experience, had explained that Metropolitan Life was expanding their fraud investigation department to address the growing problem of systematic insurance scams that were costing the company millions of dollars annually and requiring sophisticated investigative techniques to detect and prosecute through federal and state court systems. We're looking for someone who can learn to think like a criminal while maintaining the ethical standards and systematic approach necessary for building bulletproof legal cases, William had told me during that initial interview, using language that revealed both the complexity of insurance fraud investigation and the professional standards that would be required for successful prosecution of people who believed they could outsmart experienced investigators and legal systems. The work requires patience, attention to detail, and the kind of strategic thinking that can anticipate how criminals will attempt to conceal evidence and manipulate legal procedures. Quote, The position had offered a modest starting salary of $22,000 annually, basic benefits, and substantial uncertainty about long-term career advancement in a field that most people had never heard of and couldn't understand without extensive professional experience. But I had immediately recognized that the opportunity represented exactly the foundation necessary for building comprehensive expertise in criminal investigation, evidence collection, and legal prosecution that could provide both personal satisfaction and professional advancement in work that actually mattered for protecting innocent people from systematic exploitation and deliberate harm. More importantly, I had understood that insurance fraud investigation would provide systematic training in detecting and prosecuting exactly the kinds of criminals who targeted vulnerable victims for financial exploitation, inheritance fraud, and systematic manipulation that could escalate to physical threats and deliberate violence when other methods of criminal control proved insufficient for achieving their financial objectives. My first 6 months at Metropolitan Life had been devoted to comprehensive training in insurance fraud detection, evidence collection, and criminal investigation techniques that exceeded what most law enforcement agencies provided to their investigators and criminal prosecutors. The training program had been designed to create systematic expertise in every aspect of criminal behavior analysis, from recognizing initial fraud indicators to building comprehensive evidence files that could support successful prosecution through federal and state court systems. The educational curriculum had included extensive coursework in criminal psychology, legal procedures, evidence standards, and investigative techniques that provided foundation knowledge for understanding how insurance fraudsters operated and what investigative approaches would be most effective for detecting their criminal activities and building comprehensive cases that could withstand challenges from defense attorneys and criminal appeals processes. But perhaps most importantly, the training had included systematic exposure to actual criminal cases and real-world investigation scenarios that provided practical experience with the kind of sophisticated fraud schemes and systematic criminal behavior that characterized the most dangerous and financially motivated criminals in contemporary society. My first major case assignment had involved investigating a suspicious automobile accident claim that initially appeared to be a straightforward collision between two vehicles, but had actually been a carefully orchestrated fraud scheme involving multiple participants, staged vehicle damage, false medical claims, and systematic coordination between several individuals who believed they could manipulate insurance procedures and legal systems for substantial financial gain without detection or prosecution. The investigation had required months of systematic evidence collection, behavior analysis, and strategic surveillance that gradually revealed the comprehensive criminal conspiracy and provided sufficient evidence for successful prosecution of all participants through federal court proceedings that resulted in substantial prison sentences and complete financial recovery of fraudulent claims and investigation costs. But more importantly, the case had provided fundamental training in recognizing the behavioral patterns and systematic approaches that characterized professional criminals who specialized in insurance fraud and financial exploitation of institutional systems that they believed were vulnerable to manipulation and systematic abuse by people who understood legal procedures and evidence requirements better than their intended victims. The most dangerous criminals are always the ones who think they understand the system better than the people who are paid to catch them, William Morrison had explained during our case review meetings following successful prosecution of the automobile fraud conspiracy. They study legal procedures and evidence requirements until they believe they can commit crimes without leaving sufficient proof for conviction, but they always underestimate the investigative techniques and evidence collection capabilities that experienced professionals can apply to their criminal activities. The lesson had been both professionally valuable and personally relevant, because it had established the foundation principle that would guide my entire career approach to criminal investigation and evidence collection. Systematic criminals always underestimate their victims and the professional resources that can be deployed against them when they target the wrong people for financial exploitation and systematic manipulation. During my second year at Metropolitan Life, I had been assigned to increasingly complex fraud investigations that required advanced techniques and systematic coordination with law enforcement agencies, legal professionals, and expert witnesses who could provide specialized knowledge and professional testimony for comprehensive criminal prosecutions that would eliminate repeat offenders and deter similar criminal activities throughout our regional jurisdiction. The cases had included sophisticated medical fraud schemes involving false injury claims, fraudulent disability documentation, and systematic coordination between medical professionals and criminal organizations that specialized in insurance fraud and systematic exploitation of benefit programs designed to provide legitimate assistance for people with genuine medical needs and financial hardship. One particularly complex investigation had involved a systematic scheme where criminals were deliberately causing automobile accidents involving elderly drivers, then filing false injury claims and pursuing systematic legal action designed to extract maximum financial settlements from insurance companies, while providing minimal actual medical treatment or legitimate injury recovery services for their supposed victims. The scheme had been particularly insidious because it targeted elderly drivers who were less likely to understand legal procedures or question medical recommendations from healthcare professionals who appeared to be providing legitimate treatment while actually participating in systematic criminal exploitation designed to maximize insurance payouts and legal settlements through false claims and fraudulent medical documentation. The investigation had required comprehensive surveillance, systematic analysis of medical records and legal documents, and strategic coordination with law enforcement agencies that specialized in elder abuse and systematic criminal exploitation of vulnerable populations who lacked understanding of legal procedures and evidence requirements necessary for protecting themselves from systematic manipulation and financial abuse. But perhaps most importantly, the case had provided extensive training in the specific techniques and behavioral patterns that criminals employed when targeting elderly victims for systematic exploitation, including family isolation, emotional manipulation, and systematic pressure designed to prevent victims from seeking independent advice or professional assistance that might interfere with criminal objectives and financial exploitation schemes. Elder abuse and inheritance fraud represent some of the most sophisticated criminal activities we investigate, my supervisor had explained during case planning meetings for the automobile fraud prosecution. The criminals study their victims systematically and understand exactly how to exploit age-related vulnerabilities and family relationship dynamics to achieve their financial objectives while minimizing risk of detection and prosecution. The training had been invaluable for understanding how people like Vanessa operated, and what investigative techniques would be most effective for detecting and documenting their criminal planning and systematic manipulation activities before they could successfully complete their schemes and escape with stolen assets, or eliminate witnesses who might testify against them in criminal proceedings. By my third year at Metropolitan Life, I had developed sufficient expertise and professional reputation to be assigned to the most complex and high-value fraud investigations that required advanced techniques and systematic coordination with federal agencies, specialized law enforcement units, and expert witnesses who could provide technical analysis and professional testimony for criminal prosecutions that involved sophisticated evidence collection and legal strategies. The specialized assignments had included comprehensive investigation of inheritance fraud schemes involving systematic family manipulation, estate planning fraud, and criminal coordination between multiple individuals who targeted elderly victims for systematic exploitation designed to gain access to substantial assets through manipulation of legal procedures and family relationship dynamics. One particularly sophisticated case had involved a criminal organization that specialized in identifying elderly individuals with substantial assets but limited family oversight, then systematically introducing romantic partners or caregivers who would gradually gain emotional influence and legal authority over financial decisions through marriage, adoption, or systematic manipulation of estate planning documents and beneficiary arrangements. The scheme had required months of systematic preparation and coordination between multiple criminals who understood legal procedures, estate planning requirements, and family relationship dynamics well enough to manipulate vulnerable elderly victims without triggering obvious suspicion from family members or professional advisors who might recognize criminal activity and initiate protective intervention or law enforcement investigation. The investigation had required advanced surveillance techniques, comprehensive financial analysis, and systematic coordination with estate planning attorneys, financial advisors, and family court officials who could provide expert analysis of legal documents and financial transactions that revealed systematic criminal manipulation and evidence of deliberate fraud designed to steal substantial assets through systematic exploitation of legal procedures and family relationships. But perhaps most importantly, the case had provided comprehensive training in the specific evidence collection and documentation techniques that would be necessary for building successful criminal cases against people who specialized in inheritance fraud and systematic manipulation of elderly victims, through strategic relationship development and family isolation that eliminated protective oversight and enabled systematic criminal exploitation. Inheritance fraud cases require the most comprehensive evidence collection and systematic documentation because the criminals understand legal procedures well enough to create plausible explanations for their activities. I had learned during extensive training sessions with federal prosecutors who specialized in elder abuse and systematic financial exploitation. Success requires systematic documentation of criminal intent and behavior patterns that prove deliberate manipulation rather than legitimate relationship development or estate planning assistance. Quote, "The training had provided exactly the foundation necessary for understanding how Vanessa's systematic manipulation of Daniel and our family relationship represented criminal planning rather than normal marriage relationship challenges or family adaptation difficulties that could be resolved through improved communication and mutual compromise." During my 4th and 5th years at Metropolitan Life, my success rate in solving complex fraud cases and securing criminal convictions had earned promotion to senior fraud investigator with expanded responsibility for training other investigators and developing new techniques for detecting sophisticated criminal schemes that evolved faster than traditional investigative approaches could address. The senior position had required comprehensive understanding of criminal psychology, legal procedures, evidence standards, and investigative techniques that could be applied to any type of systematic fraud or criminal exploitation, while maintaining professional relationships with law enforcement agencies, legal professionals, and expert witnesses who could provide specialized knowledge and technical assistance for complex criminal prosecutions. But perhaps most importantly, the senior role had provided systematic exposure to the most sophisticated and dangerous criminals in our regional jurisdiction, including people who specialized in targeting elderly victims for systematic exploitation through family manipulation, estate planning, fraud, and inheritance schemes that required comprehensive criminal planning and systematic coordination between multiple individuals who understood legal procedures and evidence requirements well enough to believe they could commit crimes without detection or prosecution. The advanced cases had included systematic investigation of criminal organizations that specialized in elder abuse, inheritance fraud, and systematic financial exploitation through strategic relationship development and family manipulation that eliminated protective oversight while providing access to substantial assets through marriage, adoption, or systematic manipulation of estate planning documents and legal authority arrangements. One particularly complex investigation had involved a criminal network that specialized in identifying elderly individuals with substantial assets but limited family protection, then systematically introducing romantic partners who would gradually gain emotional influence and legal authority over financial decisions through strategic relationship development and systematic manipulation of family dynamics that eliminated independent advice and protective intervention. The scheme had been particularly sophisticated because it included comprehensive background research, systematic psychological manipulation, and strategic legal planning that created plausible explanations for asset transfers and beneficiary changes, while actually representing systematic criminal exploitation designed to steal substantial wealth through manipulation of legal procedures and family relationship dynamics. The investigation had required coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies, federal financial crime units, and specialized prosecutors who understood the complex legal and evidentiary requirements for successfully prosecuting sophisticated criminal organizations that specialized in systematic elder abuse and inheritance fraud through strategic relationship manipulation and family isolation techniques. By my 7th year at Metropolitan Life, I had been promoted to Director of Special Investigations with responsibility for the most complex and high-value fraud cases throughout our multi-state regional jurisdiction, including systematic coordination with federal agencies and specialized law enforcement units that investigated criminal organizations and sophisticated fraud schemes that crossed state boundaries and required advanced investigative techniques and legal strategies. The director position had provided comprehensive authority over case assignments, investigative resources, and strategic planning for systematic criminal prosecutions that involved multiple agencies and complex legal coordination between federal and state jurisdictions that required specialized knowledge of evidence standards and prosecutorial procedures for successful conviction of sophisticated criminal organizations. But perhaps most importantly, the senior executive role had provided systematic access to criminal intelligence and investigative resources that revealed the full scope of elder abuse and inheritance fraud activities throughout our regional jurisdiction, including detailed analysis of criminal methods, victim targeting techniques, and systematic approaches to family manipulation and estate planning fraud, that enabled comprehensive understanding of how people like Vanessa operated and what investigative techniques would be most effective for detecting and prosecuting their. The regional responsibility had included systematic coordination with federal agencies that investigated criminal organizations specializing in elder abuse and systematic financial exploitation through strategic relationship development and family manipulation that eliminated protective oversight while providing access to substantial assets through systematic manipulation of legal procedures and estate planning arrangements. The federal coordination had provided access to advanced investigative techniques, specialized surveillance equipment, and expert analysis capabilities that exceeded what most local law enforcement agencies could provide for complex criminal investigations that required systematic evidence collection and comprehensive legal strategies for successful prosecution of sophisticated criminal organizations. During my tenure as regional director, I had been responsible for investigating and prosecuting criminal organizations that had stolen millions of dollars through systematic elder abuse and inheritance fraud schemes, including several cases that involved attempted murder of elderly victims who had discovered criminal activities and threatened to expose systematic exploitation through law enforcement investigation and criminal prosecution. Eleanor has become our go-to expert for the most sophisticated elder abuse and inheritance fraud cases because she understands both the criminal psychology and the legal requirements for building bulletproof cases against people who think they're smarter than the system. Federal prosecutor Janet Williams had written in a professional evaluation that would become part of my permanent employment record and professional credentials for expert witness testimony in federal court proceedings. During my final decade at Metropolitan Life before retirement, I had been responsible for developing innovative investigative techniques and evidence collection procedures that could address the most sophisticated criminal schemes and systematic fraud activities that traditional approaches couldn't effectively detect or prosecute through conventional legal procedures and evidence standards. The advanced techniques had included systematic use of surveillance technology, digital evidence collection, and behavioral analysis that could document criminal planning and systematic manipulation activities, even when criminals believed they had successfully concealed their activities, through careful operational security and systematic countermeasures designed to prevent detection and evidence collection. The technological advancement had been particularly important because sophisticated criminals had begun using digital communication systems and electronic financial arrangements that traditional investigative approaches couldn't effectively monitor or analyze, for evidence of criminal planning and systematic coordination between multiple individuals involved in complex fraud schemes and inheritance exploitation activities. But perhaps most importantly, the advanced techniques had included comprehensive approaches to family relationship analysis and systematic documentation of manipulation patterns that could prove criminal intent and deliberate exploitation, even when criminals had created plausible explanations for their activities, and systematic relationship development with elderly victims who appeared to be willing participants in financial arrangements and estate planning modifications. The family relationship analysis had been particularly valuable for cases involving inheritance fraud and systematic manipulation of elderly victims through strategic relationship development and emotional control that eliminated independent advice and protective oversight while providing access to substantial assets through marriage, legal authority arrangements, or systematic manipulation of estate planning documents and beneficiary designations. The comprehensive approach had included systematic documentation of behavior patterns, communication analysis, and financial transaction monitoring that could reveal criminal intent and systematic planning, even when individual actions appeared legitimate, and could be explained as normal relationship development or estate planning assistance provided by caring family members or romantic partners. Throughout my career advancement at Metropolitan Life, I had systematically developed professional relationships with law enforcement agencies, legal professionals, and criminal justice specialists who shared information about criminal trends and investigative techniques while providing mutual assistance for complex cases that required specialized knowledge and interagency coordination for successful prosecution of sophisticated criminal organizations. The professional networking had been essential for staying current with criminal methods and investigative technologies while maintaining access to specialized resources and expert analysis capabilities that individual agencies couldn't provide independently for complex criminal investigations that required comprehensive evidence collection and systematic legal strategies. The network had included federal investigators who specialized in elder abuse and inheritance fraud, state prosecutors who understood complex evidence requirements for sophisticated criminal cases, and local law enforcement officers who could provide immediate response and protective services for elderly victims who faced systematic threats or potential violence from criminals who had been detected and might attempt to eliminate witnesses or evidence that could support criminal prosecution. But perhaps most importantly, the professional relationships had included expert witnesses and technical specialists who could provide professional testimony and systematic analysis of evidence that would support criminal prosecutions against sophisticated criminals who attempted to challenge evidence validity and legal procedures through expensive defense attorneys and systematic appeals processes designed to escape criminal conviction and civil liability. The expert witness network had been particularly valuable for cases involving systematic manipulation and inheritance fraud because it included psychologists who understood manipulation techniques, financial analysts who could trace complex asset transfers, and legal experts who could explain systematic fraud schemes and criminal intent to judges and juries who lacked professional experience with sophisticated criminal activities. Dr. Margaret Stevens, a forensic psychologist who specialized in elder abuse and systematic manipulation analysis, had become a particularly valuable professional contact who could provide expert analysis of behavior patterns and manipulation techniques that revealed criminal intent and systematic planning, even when individual actions appeared legitimate, and could be explained as normal relationship development or family assistance. Eleanor's systematic approach to evidence collection and behavior analysis provides exactly the kind of comprehensive documentation that's necessary for proving criminal intent in sophisticated manipulation cases, Dr. Stevens had explained during professional consultation meetings where we coordinated expert analysis and testimony for complex criminal prosecutions. Her understanding of both criminal psychology and legal evidence requirements enables her to build cases that can withstand the most aggressive defense challenges. By the time I reached my final years before retirement, my professional reputation and success rate in complex fraud investigations had created systematic access to resources and professional assistance that exceeded what most individual investigators could obtain through normal channels and procedural requests for interagency coordination and specialized technical assistance. The professional recognition had included regular consultation requests from federal agencies, state prosecutors, and specialized law enforcement units that investigated criminal organizations and systematic fraud schemes, requiring advanced techniques and comprehensive legal strategies for successful prosecution of sophisticated criminals who understood legal procedures and evidence requirements well enough to believe they could commit crimes without detection or conviction. The consultation work had provided continuing education about criminal trends and investigative technologies, while maintaining professional relationships and specialized access to resources that would continue to be available after retirement for personal security purposes, and systematic response to criminal threats that might require professional intervention and comprehensive legal action. Federal Agent Robert Chen, who directed the Regional Elder Abuse Task Force, had established systematic protocols for providing immediate investigative assistance and protective services for elderly victims who face systematic threats from sophisticated criminals, including automatic access to federal resources and specialized protective measures for people with professional backgrounds and criminal justice experience who might be targeted for elimination or systematic intimidation. We consider Eleanor a continuing professional resource and maintain standing protocols for immediate response if she encounters criminal threats or systematic exploitation attempts. Agent Chen had explained during retirement planning meetings that established continuing access to federal investigative resources and protective services. Her professional background and expert knowledge make her both a valuable consultant and a potential target for sophisticated criminals who might attempt retaliation or systematic elimination. The federal protocols had included automatic investigation of any suspicious activities or systematic threats directed at retired investigators, immediate access to protective services and specialized security measures, and systematic prosecution of anyone who attempted criminal activities against former professionals who possessed expert knowledge and continuing access to criminal justice resources. Eleanor Whitmore had spent 35 years building exactly the kind of professional expertise and systematic access to criminal justice resources that would enable comprehensive response to any criminal threats or systematic exploitation attempts. including immediate detection of criminal planning and systematic evidence collection that could support devastating legal prosecution and civil recovery against people who made the mistake of targeting someone whose professional background had been specifically designed to catch and destroy people exactly like them. The foundation had been comprehensive, the expertise had been systematic, and the professional networks had been maintained and strengthened throughout retirement, creating exactly the kind of devastating response capability that would soon demonstrate to Vanessa why attempting to murder a former fraud investigator was the most catastrophically stupid criminal decision that anyone in our county's history had ever made. To understand how devastating Vanessa's systematic destruction of our family relationship would become, and why her attempted murder represented the most catastrophic miscalculation in criminal history, you need to understand exactly how the relationship between Daniel and me had functioned for 32 years before she entered our lives. A relationship built on genuine mutual respect, collaborative problem-solving, and the kind of unconditional love that had created both personal fulfillment and practical advantages that enhanced every aspect of Daniel's professional development. And the golden years of our family relationship hadn't been characterized by dependency or obligation, but rather by voluntary collaboration and mutual support that provided benefits for both of us while respecting individual autonomy and personal goals that sometimes required independent decision-making and separate priorities that complemented rather than conflicted with our family connection and shared values. From the time Daniel had graduated from college until Vanessa began her systematic isolation campaign, our interactions had been characterized by regular communication that enhanced rather than limited his individual development, strategic guidance that supported his professional advancement without creating dependency, and family traditions that provided emotional satisfaction and practical benefits without requiring sacrifice of personal relationships or career opportunities that might take him in different directions. But perhaps most importantly, our family relationship had been built on complete honesty about financial planning, inheritance arrangements, and long-term security considerations that provided Daniel with comprehensive understanding of family assets while ensuring his independence from any pressure to maintain family relationships for financial reasons, rather than genuine affection and mutual respect that would survive disagreements and individual life changes. Daniel had always known exactly what he stood to inherit from my estate, including detailed information about investment portfolios, property values, and legal arrangements that would provide him with substantial financial independence and security, regardless of his personal relationships, marriage choices, or career decisions that might affect his lifestyle and priorities in ways that could create tension with family expectations or traditional values. The transparency had been deliberately designed to prevent exactly the kind of manipulation and financial pressure that predators like Vanessa typically employed against family relationships. Because Daniel understood that his inheritance was guaranteed through professional estate planning that couldn't be influenced by marriage relationships, or modified through emotional manipulation and systematic pressure designed to gain access to family wealth through spousal claims or legal challenges. During Daniel's 20s and early 30s, our family relationship had represented everything that healthy parent-adult-child relationships could and should be: collaborative, supportive, and mutually beneficial without crossing boundaries into inappropriate dependency or systematic control that might limit individual growth and personal development. When Daniel had been searching for his first professional position after college graduation, I had provided strategic guidance about career planning and professional development that enhanced his interview skills and strategic thinking, without creating dependency on family connections or inherited advantages that might compromise his individual achievement and personal confidence in his own capabilities and professional competence. Mom, I really value your perspective on these job opportunities, because you understand how professional relationships work and what kinds of environments would provide the best foundation for long-term career advancement, Daniel had told me during our career planning discussions that had focused on his individual goals, rather than family expectations, or inherited advantages that might influence his decisions for reasons other than personal satisfaction and professional development. The guidance I had provided had been based on my professional experience with business development and strategic planning, rather than family authority or emotional manipulation, creating collaborative problem-solving that enhanced his decision-making capabilities, while respecting his autonomy and individual judgment about career priorities and personal goals that would shape his adult life and professional identity. When Daniel had been considering the purchase of his first home, our collaboration had included comprehensive financial analysis and strategic planning that helped him understand mortgage options, investment considerations, and long-term financial planning, while ensuring the decision was entirely his own choice based on his individual circumstances, rather than family pressure or inherited expectations about lifestyle and residential arrangements. I want to make sure I'm making this decision for the right reasons and with complete understanding of the financial implications, Daniel had explained when seeking my advice about real estate investment and mortgage arrangements. Your experience with financial planning and investment analysis helps me understand considerations that I might not recognize on my own, but I want to be sure I'm choosing something that fits my own priorities and circumstances. The collaborative approach had provided him with access to sophisticated financial analysis and strategic thinking, while maintaining complete autonomy over personal decisions on lifestyle choices that reflected his individual values and preferences rather than family expectations or inherited advantages that might compromise his personal satisfaction and independent achievement. Throughout Daniel's adult development, our family traditions and social arrangements had been designed to provide emotional satisfaction and practical benefits, while respecting individual schedules and personal relationships that might require flexible arrangements and adaptation to changing circumstances that affected availability and priorities. Our weekly dinner arrangements had been voluntarily chosen and mutually enjoyable rather than obligatory family requirements that created pressure or systematic expectations about time management and social priorities that might conflict with individual relationships and professional responsibilities that required attention and energy. I always look forward to our Sunday dinners because they provide consistent family time without interfering with my work schedule or social relationships, Daniel had mentioned during conversations about family arrangements and tradition maintenance. It's nice to have predictable family time that doesn't require complicated scheduling or create conflicts with other commitments and relationships. The family gatherings had included Daniel's friends and romantic partners who were genuinely welcomed and encouraged to participate in family activities and traditions, rather than being viewed as threats to family relationships or systematic challenges to established patterns and expectations that might create tension or competition for attention and loyalty. Previous girlfriends had been genuinely embraced and included in family activities because they contributed to Daniel's happiness and personal development, rather than representing systematic threats to family influence or financial arrangements that required defensive measures and protective strategies to maintain family assets and inheritance security. Sarah Mitchell, whom Daniel had dated for 2 years during his late 20s, had become a genuine family friend who continued to maintain positive relationships with our family, even after their romantic relationship had ended due to career opportunities that required relocation rather than relationship problems or family disapproval that might have created lasting tension or negative feelings. I've always appreciated how welcoming your family has been, Sarah had told Daniel during their relationship, and continued to mention during occasional social contact that maintained positive connections without inappropriate involvement in family decisions or financial arrangements. It's obvious that your mother wants you to be happy and supports your individual choices rather than trying to control your relationships or personal decisions. The inclusive approach had created positive family dynamics and enhanced Daniel's confidence in family support for his individual happiness and personal development, rather than systematic control or manipulation that might compromise his judgment about romantic relationships and personal choices that affected his lifestyle and long-term goals. Perhaps the most valuable aspect of our family relationship had been my ability to provide professional mentorship and strategic guidance that enhanced Daniel's career development without creating dependency or systematic advantages that might compromise his individual achievement and personal confidence in his own professional competence and strategic thinking capabilities. My background in fraud investigation and business analysis had provided comprehensive understanding of professional relationship management, strategic planning, and systematic problem-solving that could enhance Daniel's effectiveness in accounting and financial services without direct involvement in his workplace or inappropriate family influence over his professional decisions and career advancement opportunities. Your experience with systematic analysis and professional relationship management helps me understand considerations that business school didn't really address, Daniel had explained when seeking guidance about client relationship development and strategic career planning. You understand how professional networks actually function and what kinds of relationship building approaches create long-term advantages rather than short-term benefits that might not support sustained career advancement. The professional guidance had been provided through collaborative analysis and strategic thinking rather than direct intervention or family connections that might compromise his individual achievement and personal satisfaction with professional success that was entirely the result of his own competence and effort, rather than inherited advantages or family influence that could affect his credibility and professional reputation. When Daniel had been considering advancement opportunities that required strategic decision-making about career trajectory and professional development priorities, our discussions had provided comprehensive analysis of options and considerations, while ensuring the final decisions were entirely his own choices based on personal goals and individual circumstances, rather than family expectations or inherited pressure that might influence his judgment for reasons other than professional satisfaction and career advancement. I appreciate having access to strategic thinking and professional analysis that helps me understand the full scope of these opportunities, Daniel had said during career planning discussions that focused on his individual goals and professional development priorities. Your systematic approach to analyzing complex situations helps me make better decisions while ensuring they're entirely my own choices based on my personal priorities and circumstances. The mentorship had created genuine professional development and enhanced strategic thinking capabilities, while maintaining complete respect for his individual autonomy and personal judgment about career decisions that would shape his professional identity and long-term satisfaction with work that provided both financial security and personal fulfillment. One of the most important foundations of our healthy family relationship had been complete transparency about financial arrangements, inheritance planning, and long-term security considerations that prevented the kind of systematic manipulation and inheritance pressure that predators like Vanessa typically employed to gain control over family financial decisions and estate planning arrangements. Daniel had been provided with comprehensive information about family assets, investment portfolios, and estate planning structures from the time he reached adult independence, creating complete understanding of inheritance arrangements and financial security that eliminated mystery and systematic pressure about family wealth and legacy planning that might affect his personal relationships and decision-making processes. I want you to understand exactly what your inheritance includes and how it's structured, so you can make informed decisions about your own financial planning without wondering about family assets or feeling pressure to maintain family relationships for financial security reasons. I had explained during comprehensive financial planning discussions that provided complete transparency about estate arrangements and inheritance security. The financial transparency had included detailed information about investment strategies, asset protection protocols, and legal arrangements that would ensure his long-term financial security, regardless of personal relationships, marriage decisions, or career changes that might affect his lifestyle and priorities, in ways that could create financial pressure or systematic dependency on family resources and support. But perhaps most importantly, the financial arrangements had been specifically designed to prevent spousal access and inheritance manipulation through legal safeguards and professional estate planning that would protect family assets from predatory individuals who might attempt to gain access to substantial wealth through marriage manipulation and systematic family isolation that eliminated protective oversight and independent advice. Your inheritance is protected through trust structures and legal arrangements that prevent anyone other than you from gaining access to family assets, I had explained during estate planning discussions that provided comprehensive understanding of asset protection and inheritance security. Marriage relationships can't affect your inheritance rights, and spousal claims can't compromise family asset protection or modify beneficiary arrangements that have been established through professional legal planning. The protection had been designed specifically to prevent exactly the kind of inheritance fraud and systematic manipulation that Vanessa would eventually attempt, because professional estate planning had anticipated systematic threats and criminal exploitation that might target family wealth through marriage manipulation and family relationship control. Throughout Daniel's adult development, our family relationship had been characterized by systematic support for his individual goals and personal development that enhanced rather than limited his independence and autonomous decision-making about career advancement, romantic relationships, and lifestyle choices that reflected his personal values and individual priorities. The support had been provided without systematic expectations or obligation requirements that might create pressure for maintaining family relationships through duty, rather than genuine affection and mutual respect that survived disagreements and individual life changes that could affect priorities and availability for family interaction and tradition maintenance. When Daniel had been considering professional advancement opportunities that required additional education and training, I had provided financial support for continuing education expenses without creating systematic obligation or expectation for family influence over career decisions and professional development priorities that should be based entirely on individual goals and personal satisfaction rather than family expectations or inherited pressure. I want to support your professional development because it enhances your individual capabilities and career satisfaction, I had explained when offering financial assistance for advanced training and professional education programs. The support is provided because I believe in your potential and want to see you achieve your individual goals, rather than creating obligation or systematic expectations about family relationships or career decisions. The financial support had been provided through structured arrangements that prevented dependency and maintained clear boundaries between family assistance and individual responsibility for career development and professional achievement that would provide personal satisfaction and individual confidence in professional competence and strategic capabilities. When Daniel had been experiencing temporary financial challenges during economic downturns that affected his professional income and career stability, family assistance had been provided through systematic arrangements that supported his independence while providing security during difficult circumstances that were beyond his individual control and required temporary assistance rather than long-term dependency. Family support should enhance individual independence and personal security, rather than creating systematic dependency or obligation that might compromise autonomous decision-making and personal confidence. I had explained during financial assistance discussions that focused on temporary support, rather than systematic dependency, that might affect his individual development and personal satisfaction with autonomous achievement and professional success. The healthy family relationship that Vanessa had systematically destroyed through manipulation and isolation had represented everything that family connections should provide: mutual support, collaborative problem-solving, enhanced individual development, and unconditional love that survived disagreements and personal changes while respecting individual autonomy and supporting personal goals that might require independent decision-making and separate priorities. The destruction had been particularly devastating because it had eliminated systematic support and strategic guidance that had enhanced Daniel's professional development and personal satisfaction while providing family connection and emotional security that contributed to his overall well-being and individual confidence in his own capabilities and judgment about career advancement and personal relationships. But perhaps most tragically, Vanessa's systematic isolation had eliminated access to professional expertise and investigative capabilities that could have protected Daniel from exactly the kind of criminal exploitation and inheritance fraud that she was systematically planning through marriage manipulation and family relationship control that would eventually escalate to attempted murder when other methods proved insufficient for achieving her financial objectives. The family relationship that had once provided comprehensive protection and strategic guidance had been replaced by systematic manipulation and criminal planning that would ultimately expose Daniel to devastating legal consequences and criminal liability that could affect his professional reputation and personal security for the remainder of his life. The evening when Vanessa would finally reveal her true intentions through attempted murder had begun as what should have been a celebration of family tradition and gratitude for the blessings that had characterized our family relationship throughout Daniel's entire adult development, including professional success, personal happiness, and family connections that had provided both emotional satisfaction and practical advantages for individual growth and security. The Thanksgiving gathering had been planned to include Daniel's small family and my longtime friend Margaret Stevens, the forensic psychologist who had provided professional consultation throughout my career, who had been invited to join our family celebration as someone who understood the importance of family relationships and had contributed to my professional development and continuing education about criminal behavior and systematic manipulation techniques. The presence of Dr. Stevens should have encouraged appropriate social behavior and family courtesy that reflected well on Daniel's character and demonstrated the kind of respectful family relationships that indicated healthy personal development and appropriate social values. Instead, the dinner had provided Vanessa with the perfect opportunity to implement criminal planning that had been developing for months through systematic intelligence gathering and strategic preparation for eliminating the primary obstacle to her inheritance access and financial exploitation objectives. The conversation during dinner had initially focused on positive family developments and traditional expressions of gratitude for professional advancement, family relationships, and personal security that had characterized our family experience throughout Daniel's adult life. Dr. Stevens had contributed meaningful observations about family relationship research and psychological factors that enhanced individual development and personal satisfaction through healthy family connections and mutual support systems. Research consistently demonstrates that healthy family relationships provide substantial benefits for individual development and personal security. Dr. Stevens had mentioned during dinner conversation that focused on positive family dynamics and tradition maintenance. Families that maintain mutual respect and collaborative problem-solving create systematic advantages for individual achievement and emotional well-being that enhance rather than limit personal development and autonomous decision-making. Quote, but as dinner progressed and family conversation continued, Vanessa had become increasingly uncomfortable with discussions that highlighted healthy family relationships and mutual support systems that contradicted her systematic narrative about inappropriate family dependency and controlling behavior that supposedly required defensive measures and protective isolation to maintain individual autonomy and marriage relationship priorities. The systematic transformation from family celebration to criminal opportunity had occurred when Dr. Stevens had excused herself to take an important phone call regarding a criminal case consultation, and Danielle had stepped into the kitchen to begin clearing dinner dishes and preparing coffee service, leaving Vanessa and me alone in the dining room for what would become the most catastrophic few minutes in Whitmore family history. I need to get something from the basement storage area, I had mentioned casually, referring to family photo albums that Dr. Stevens had expressed interest in seeing as examples of positive family relationship development over extended periods. There are some pictures from Daniel's college years that show how proud I've always been of his individual achievements and professional development. The innocent comment had apparently triggered Vanessa's recognition that this represented the perfect opportunity for implementing criminal planning that had been developing through months of systematic preparation and intelligence gathering about my daily routines, household security arrangements, and family interaction patterns that could provide criminal opportunity without obvious detection or immediate discovery. I'll come with you, Vanessa had said, with obvious eagerness that should have triggered immediate suspicion but had been masked by apparent helpfulness and social courtesy that seemed appropriate for family gathering assistance and collaborative activity. Maybe I can help you find what you're looking for and carry things upstairs. The offer had seemed like normal family assistance and social cooperation rather than criminal opportunity creation, but it had actually represented the culmination of systematic planning and strategic preparation for attempted murder that would eliminate the primary obstacle to inheritance access, while providing plausible explanation for accidental death that could avoid criminal investigation and legal consequences. The basement area where Vanessa would attempt to murder me had been specifically prepared for exactly this type of criminal activity, through comprehensive surveillance equipment and evidence collection systems that would document every aspect of criminal behavior, while providing immediate alert capabilities for emergency response and law enforcement intervention if systematic threats escalated to the level of immediate physical danger. As we descended the basement stairs together, Vanessa had positioned herself behind me in what appeared to be normal stair navigation, but had actually been strategic positioning for physical attack that would create maximum damage while providing plausible explanation for accidental fall that could avoid criminal investigation and systematic prosecution for attempted murder and inheritance fraud. You know, Eleanor, Vanessa had said in a tone that had immediately revealed systematic planning and criminal intent rather than casual conversation or family interaction. I've been thinking about how difficult it must be for someone your age to maintain this big house and manage all these stairs safely. The comment had been designed to establish narrative foundation for accidental death explanation, while simultaneously revealing criminal planning and systematic preparation for eliminating perceived obstacles to inheritance access and financial exploitation that had been the true motivation for her relationship with Daniel and systematic family manipulation throughout their marriage. But what Vanessa hadn't anticipated was that the 70-year-old woman she was about to attack possessed exactly the kind of professional training and systematic preparation necessary for surviving criminal assault, while documenting comprehensive evidence that would support devastating criminal prosecution and civil recovery that would destroy her life far more completely than she had planned to destroy mine. When Vanessa had suddenly pushed me down the basement stairs while hissing, Accidents happen to old ladies who don't know when to mind their own business. She had immediately provided comprehensive evidence of criminal intent, systematic planning, and attempted murder that would support federal prosecution and civil litigation that would eliminate any possibility of inheritance access, while ensuring substantial prison sentences and financial destruction that would serve as permanent deterrent against similar criminal activities. But instead of the fatal fall that Vanessa had planned, her attempted murder had encountered exactly the kind of defensive preparation and systematic response capability that 35 years of criminal investigation and evidence collection had provided for protecting against systematic threats and criminal violence. The physical attack that Vanessa believed would eliminate the only person standing between her and Daniel's inheritance had actually triggered comprehensive evidence collection and systematic legal response that would demonstrate exactly what happens when professional investigators are targeted by criminals who have completely underestimated the expertise and resource access that their intended victims possess for systematic retaliation and criminal prosecution. Instead of falling to my death as Vanessa had planned, I had controlled the fall using defensive techniques that had been systematically practiced for exactly this type of criminal assault, while ensuring that comprehensive surveillance equipment documented every aspect of criminal behavior and systematic evidence collection that would support devastating legal prosecution. The basement surveillance systems had recorded high-definition video and audio evidence of attempted murder, including Vanessa's verbal admission of criminal intent and systematic planning for eliminating obstacles to inheritance access. The evidence collection had been comprehensive and immediate, providing exactly the kind of documentation that would support federal prosecution and civil litigation that could withstand any defense challenges and ensure maximum criminal penalties and financial recovery. But perhaps most importantly, the attempted murder had triggered automatic alert systems that immediately notified law enforcement agencies and emergency response services while beginning systematic evidence preservation and legal response coordination that would ensure comprehensive prosecution and civil recovery, regardless of any attempts at evidence destruction or witness intimidation. Within minutes of the attack, federal agents had been dispatched to secure the crime scene and begin systematic evidence collection that would support comprehensive criminal prosecution, while emergency medical services had been alerted to provide immediate medical evaluation and documentation of criminal assault that would support both criminal charges and civil litigation for attempted murder and systematic inheritance fraud. Dr. Stevens, whose professional expertise in criminal psychology and systematic manipulation analysis had been immediately available for expert witness testimony and criminal behavior evaluation, had provided systematic analysis of Vanessa's manipulation techniques and criminal planning that demonstrated comprehensive intent for inheritance fraud and systematic family exploitation through marriage manipulation and strategic isolation. The systematic nature of Vanessa's manipulation and family isolation, combined with the deliberate planning evident in this attempted murder, demonstrates exactly the kind of comprehensive criminal scheme that our research has identified as characteristic of sophisticated inheritance fraud and systematic elder abuse. Dr. Stevens had explained during immediate consultation with federal investigators and criminal prosecutors, who would be responsible for systematic prosecution and maximum criminal penalties. The comprehensive evidence collection and systematic legal response that followed Vanessa's attempted murder had resulted in the most devastating criminal prosecution and civil litigation that anyone in our county's history had ever experienced, demonstrating exactly what happens when criminals target people whose professional background and resource access provide systematic capability for comprehensive retaliation and legal destruction. Federal prosecution had included charges for attempted murder, inheritance fraud, systematic elder abuse, and criminal conspiracy that carried maximum penalties, including substantial prison sentences and complete financial recovery of all assets that had been obtained through criminal activity and systematic manipulation. The evidence had been so comprehensive and systematic that defense challenges had been completely unsuccessful, resulting in guilty verdicts on all charges and maximum criminal penalties that would ensure Vanessa spent decades in federal prison while losing everything she had hoped to steal through criminal activity. But perhaps more devastating had been the civil litigation that had resulted in systematic recovery of all financial benefits that Vanessa had obtained through marriage manipulation and criminal activity. including complete asset forfeiture and financial penalties that eliminated any possibility of future financial security or independence, following eventual release from federal prison. The civil recovery had included systematic analysis of all financial benefits that Vanessa had obtained through strategic relationship development and family manipulation, resulting in comprehensive financial penalties and asset forfeiture that would ensure permanent financial destruction and systematic deterrent against similar criminal activities by other predatory individuals who might consider targeting elderly victims for inheritance fraud and systematic exploitation. Daniel, whose systematic isolation and manipulation had made him vulnerable to criminal exploitation and potential legal liability as an unwilling participant in inheritance fraud schemes, had been provided with comprehensive legal protection and systematic assistance for recovery from systematic manipulation and criminal exploitation that had affected his judgment and family relationships throughout their marriage. Daniel was clearly a victim of systematic manipulation and criminal exploitation rather than a willing participant in inheritance fraud activities. Federal prosecutors had explained during legal proceedings that established his status as victim rather than co-conspirator in systematic criminal activities. The comprehensive evidence demonstrates that Vanessa's systematic isolation and manipulation had been designed specifically to eliminate his access to independent advice and family protection that might have interfered with her criminal objectives. The comprehensive legal victory and systematic destruction of Vanessa's criminal scheme had resulted in complete restoration of family relationships and systematic protection against future criminal threats, while providing permanent deterrent against similar criminal activities by other predatory individuals who might consider targeting our family for systematic exploitation and inheritance fraud. Daniel's recognition of how completely he had been manipulated and systematically isolated from family protection and strategic guidance had resulted in genuine appreciation for family relationships and systematic understanding of how professional expertise and investigative capabilities had protected him from devastating criminal exploitation that could have destroyed his life and professional reputation permanently. I finally understand how much I lost when I allowed Vanessa to systematically isolate me from family relationships and strategic guidance that had always provided protection and support for my individual development and professional advancement. Daniel had acknowledged during family reconciliation, discussions that restored healthy relationship dynamics and mutual respect that had characterized our family connection throughout his adult development. The reconciliation had been based on genuine understanding of criminal manipulation and systematic appreciation for family protection and professional expertise that had prevented devastating financial exploitation and criminal liability that could have affected his professional reputation and personal security for the remainder of his life. But perhaps most importantly, the systematic justice and comprehensive legal victory had demonstrated exactly what happens when criminals target people whose professional background and strategic preparation provides systematic capability for devastating retaliation and comprehensive prosecution that destroys criminal lives far more completely than they had planned to destroy their intended victims. Eleanor Whitmore had spent 35 years building exactly the kind of professional expertise and systematic resource access that would enable comprehensive response to criminal threats and systematic exploitation attempts, and Vanessa had become the perfect case study in why attempting to murder a former fraud investigator was the most catastrophically stupid criminal decision that anyone in criminal history had ever made. The story that had begun with systematic manipulation and family destruction had ended with complete justice and permanent protection, proving that some elderly women are far more dangerous than they appear when you make the mistake of underestimating their professional training and systematic preparation for exactly the kind of criminal behavior that predatory individuals employ against vulnerable targets who supposedly lack capability for sophisticated retaliation and comprehensive legal response. Have you ever witnessed someone make such a catastrophic miscalculation that they basically handed their victim everything needed to destroy them completely? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts, because this story proves that appearances can be deceiving, and that underestimating someone based on age and apparent vulnerability can be the most devastating mistake you'll ever make. If you enjoyed this story of systematic justice, and want to hear more tales about people who discovered the hard way that some elderly women are far more dangerous than they appear, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Tomorrow's story features a young attorney who thought he could manipulate a confused elderly client in probate court. Spoiler alert, he learned exactly why that was the worst professional decision of his entire career. Remember, real power often operates through expertise and preparation rather than obvious authority, and the most dangerous people are often those who appear most harmless while possessing exactly the right background and resources to destroy anyone who makes the mistake of targeting them for criminal exploitation and systematic harm. Never underestimate someone based on appearance, age, or perceived vulnerability, because you never know when that quiet elderly person might possess 35 years of experience catching people exactly like you, and the professional resources to ensure that your criminal behavior results in comprehensive legal destruction that serves as permanent warning to anyone else who might consider similar criminal activities against people whose expertise and strategic preparation makes them the worst possible targets for systematic exploitation and deliberate harm.